Whitey on the Moon, a spoken word poem by Gil Scott-Heron, released on the 9th track of his debut album Small Talk at 125th and Linux in 1970. Intro. We have a poem here. It's called Whitey on the Moon. It was inspired by some Whiteys on the moon, so I want to give credit where credit is due. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still, while Whitey's on the moon. The man upped my rent last night, 'cause Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he upped me, 'cause Whitey's on the moon. Well, I was already giving him $50 a week with Whitey's on the moon. Taxes taking my whole damn check. Junkies making me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up, and all that this shit was enough. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey's on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey's on the moon? How come I ain't got no money here? Whitey's on the moon. You know, I just about to had my fill of Whitey's on the moon. I think I'll send these doctor bills, airmail special, to the Whitey's on the moon.
Okay, let's go there, Capcom on the hot fire. Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn, gonna go for undocking. Okay, Retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. Jinsei, go. Econ, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins arrived at the moon on Saturday, July 19th.
When we did get close and we rolled out and saw it for the first time, it was a revelation. It was gigantic. It filled our entire window.
The next day, Sunday, July 20th, was landing day.
In a lot of anticipation, we finally come to the day, the moment that this is about to commence.
Landing on the moon was absolutely the most difficult piece of any Apollo mission, okay? Think about it as a controlled fall out of lunar orbit. The problem is, in this controlled fall out of orbit, you only have enough fuel for one try.
Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4200. Houston, you're go for landing, over.
The trajectory had been wrong. They were targeted into this inhospitable place. Then they had to fly over this area at a high forward velocity, then pitch up to slow down so that kill their forward velocity, and then start down like a helicopter. So now we're critical fuel state. And that's why the 60-second call was given, and then the 30-second call.
Then I really got nervous, was calling out 25 seconds of fuel left, and then 20 seconds of fuel. Oh, jeez.
Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
The landing to me was a great celebration. The nation was almost euphoric.
Well, it proved that the United States could accomplish tremendous goals if they worked together as a team.
They say more than 60 million people were watching. Children, elders, families, strangers, all gathered around small televisions. People clustered in bars, in church basements, in classrooms, living rooms around the world, all waiting, breath held for something that had never happened before. It was Sunday, July 20th, 1969, 56 years ago today. The day human beings set foot on the moon. But that day didn't begin in space. It began 8 years earlier with a challenge. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and the world and declared, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." At the time, it sounded impossible. The rockets weren't ready, the math wasn't finished, and the Soviets had been winning the new space race. But that's what made the goal so powerful. Because meeting it would take more than just political will. It was the efforts of over 400,000 people. Scientists, engineers, janitors, seamstresses, coders, managers, mechanics, accountants, cooks, and yes, astronauts. People of every background, many of whom would never meet, would never share a lunch table, and who all had to work together, all contributing in small and large ways, but all were necessary for reaching that goal. It took private companies and government agencies. It took skeptics and believers. It took stress, mistakes, recalculations, late nights, failed launches, even tragedies. And yes, they still kept going. This wasn't just a triumph of technology. This was a triumph of cooperation under pressure. It was messy. It was human, it was flawed, and it worked. Together, they sent people for the first time to another world. And here's what I want us to remember. They did not do all of that because they agreed on everything. They did that because they agreed in something bigger than themselves. It was the power of that collective effort. That is what America can be when we work together, when we choose to. You'll note I'm not just talking about the Apollo program here. I'm also talking about the civil rights movement. Because I like my timelines. May 5th, 1961. Alan Shepard had just become the first American to travel into space. The day after, the first Freedom Riders boarded the first bus from Washington, D.C., headed to New Orleans. Both astronaut and activists risking their lives in hostile territory. In 1962, John Glenn orbited the Earth. The same year, James Meredith faced mobs and the National Guard troops to integrate the University of Mississippi. In 1963, as NASA prepared the Gemini missions and perfected the mechanisms for rendezvous and reentry, Martin Luther King Jr. and thousands marched on Washington. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation in public spaces, a hard-fought win that came 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education. The same year, June 21st, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schauwiner were murdered by local members of the KKK. NASA began testing the Saturn I rockets. In 1965, Ed White walked in space during Gemini 4, the same year that civil rights marchers went from Selma to Montgomery and were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Two different frontiers, two different types of courage. As astronauts learned to dock in space, Black Americans were still fighting for the right to vote here on Earth. And in 1967, January 27th, Apollo 1 was the fire on the launch pad. It killed Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. 5 months later, the Supreme Court handed down Loving v. Virginia to Richard and Mildred Loving, an interracial couple from Virginia. the case that ended segregation for interracial marriages. In 1968, Apollo 8 orbited the moon and captured the breathtaking Earthrise photo, reminding us of how small and fragile life and our world truly are. It was April 4th that year that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Then came 1969. While the Apollo astronauts were in their lunar descent, civil rights leaders continued to push for housing, education, and economic equality. Communities were still struggling under the weight of racism, poverty, and violence. On July 20th, 1969, humanity set foot on the moon. These histories have an interesting crossover just a few days before the Apollo 11 launch. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, one of Dr. King's closest allies, led 500 mostly Black Americans to protest the launch of the Saturn V rocket to the moon. They brought with them 2 mules and a wooden wagon from the Poor People's Campaign, symbols of poverty in a nation spending billions to send astronauts to space, while millions at home lacked food, shelter, and basic dignity. They came with signs that said $12 a day to feed an astronaut. We could feed a starving child for 8. For those living in poverty, the money spent on the program, no matter how inspiring for the mission, laid bare the nation's priorities. If we can send people to the moon, why can we not end hunger? If we can build rockets to the stars, why can't we build decent houses on Earth? If we can organize 400,000 people for a space program, why can't we organize them for justice? This wasn't a protest against the achievement. This was a protest for achievement, the kind that reaches for everyone. And here's what's really remarkable, reading up on this. The deputy director of NASA, Thomas Paine, didn't dismiss them. He went out and met with the protesters. He listened. He met with Ralph Abernathy. He invited the group to watch the launch. He acknowledged their points, saying, if we could solve the problems of poverty in the United States by not pushing the button to launch men to the moon tomorrow, then we would not push that button. The meeting ended when the two men shook hands. Abernathy and his group prayed for the astronauts. They watched the next day from the VIP section, and Abernathy is reported to say, on the eve of man's noblest venture, I am profoundly moved by the nation's achievement in space and the heroism of the 3 men embarking for the moon. But he added, what we can do for space exploration, we demand that we do for starving people. Because the protesters were right. If we could do the impossible in space, we could do the impossible on Earth. We can solve the problems of getting to the moon. We can solve the problems of getting people fed and housed and treated with dignity. The question isn't whether or not we can. The question is whether we choose to. We've spent most of this time looking back at over half a century ago, to a decade that changed the world. The 1960s showed us what is possible when human beings come together with vision, courage, and cooperation in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. We walked on the moon. We passed civil rights legislation. We reshaped the law, the language, the culture, not perfect, not completely, but powerfully, profoundly, and rapidly. And all of that happened not even in a single generation, but most in less than a decade. It wasn't easy. It wasn't inevitable, but it was the result of pressure, internal and external. It was a response to people who chose to build things instead of break things. And now we are in another one of those times. We can't pretend that we're not. The engines are firing again. The pressure is building again. And once again, we have to choose. Do we build or do we break? Everywhere we look, our technology, our climate, our politics, our culture, things are moving fast, uncomfortably fast, uncertainly fast, but not unprecedentedly fast. Artificial intelligence is reshaping our work, our education, our human connection. Climate change is displacing people, creating once-in-a-century catastrophes annually. It's redefining what it means to live on this planet. Censorship is rising, disinformation spreads like wildfire, with algorithmically curated echo chambers that keep us from learning what is even real. And around the world, fear tightens under the grip of authoritarianism. It's dizzying, it's disorienting, it's disheartening, and it's familiar. And it's familiar. Because this isn't the first time the world has spun faster than we know how to hold on to. And every time we've faced moments like this where the outcome wasn't decided by the change of pace, but by the strength of the response to it. The choice of whether we give into fear or we choose courage. Whether we isolate ourselves or if we build new coalitions. Whether we close the gates or whether we open the doors. We've done it before. We're doing it now. And we'll keep doing it if we choose to. In 1969, July 20th, that wasn't the end of the space race. The Apollo programs continued through Apollo 17 in 1972. Those same engineers, scientists, teams of thinkers and tinkers would develop new technologies that would give us satellite communication, GPS, weather tracking, and the framework for space stations. Inside NASA, more doors were being opened. The breakthroughs of Katherine Johnson and Mary Jackson and Dorothy Van Ott paved the way for a new generation of future Black women in STEM, including Mae Jemison, the first Black woman in space. In her own words, the moon landing was a moment when the impossible became real. And once that happens, the world is never the same. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, the movement didn't die, but it did change. The 1970s brought new fights, continued school integration, housing rights, economic justice initiatives. In 1971, the Supreme Court upheld busing to desegregate schools. In 1972, Sherry Crimsholm ran for president, the first Black woman to do so on a major party. In 1982, the Voting Rights Act was renewed and expanded. And in 1986, John Lewis, former freedom rider, SNCC chairman, and man who was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, was elected to Congress. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. but it does not bend on its own. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Religious communities weren't on the sidelines, they were on the front lines. Jewish and Christian clergy marched arm in arm in Selma. Catholic leaders stood with farm workers demanding dignity and fair wages. And Unitarian Universalists like Reverend James Rebb and Viola Luiso gave their lives in the struggle. Black churches, where it all started, organizing freedom schools, feeding the hungry, and sheltering the marchers, even when they were being firebombed. But in the face of all of that hate, let us not forget the joy in the face of oppression, in the tradition of those churches where music and laughter and praise were acts of resistance and notes of defiance. Because joy is not naive. Joy is strength. Joy is what makes that fight sustainable. There were songs in Selma. There were cheers in Mission Control. The joy wasn't separate from the struggle. The joy was what made that struggle possible. And that joy, that defiant, determined joy, is what we need now. Not the joy that ignores pain, but the joy that transforms it. The joy that says the work is hard, but it is also holy. The joy that says we don't know if we will succeed, but we choose anyways. Because joy is what keeps us going when the math gets hard. It's what keeps us marching when the bridge seems too far. And joy is what makes the impossible feel possible. Faith is taking the first step, even if you don't see the whole staircase. Another quote from Dr. King. These victories didn't come from perfect unity. They came from determined solidarity. These movements, like the space missions, were made possible by the collected work of imperfect people working towards a common purpose. The Apollo missions had mathematicians and mechanics. The civil rights movement had ministers and medics. They both had elders and young people, radicals and moderates, agitators and negotiators. They didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on enough to make the impossible possible. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for you? It means your work matters, whatever it is. Teacher, nurse, engineer, parent, retiree, student. Your part may feel small, but remember, every single rivet, every single circuit, every single stitch, all of them were required, or no one would have been able to get off the launch pad. It means that your voice matters. It means that your connections matter. The bridges that you build, the conversations that you start, the hands that you extend. Because every moon landing begins with someone willing to do the math. Every movement begins with someone willing to take that first step. And every change begins with someone saying, "This is possible. We choose to go to the moon." Because we've been here before, standing on the edge of the unknown, looking at the sky into the face of injustice, and wondering if we are capable of meeting the moment. And every time, the answer has been the same. Yes, we are. Not because we're perfect, not because we're ready, not because we're always willing, but we are to dream, to struggle, to reach out for one another. We are. Let's be honest for a moment. We walked on the moon, and then we walked away from it. We stopped short of what was possible because it was too expensive. After all, we had made our point, and we let that momentum stall. I'm also talking about the civil rights movement. Laws were passed, but they weren't enforced. Hearts were moved, but they weren't always changed. Dreams were spoken, but they had not yet been lived. By 1970, the attention was shifting towards Vietnam, to the campus protests, towards the women's rights movement, and towards justice for the environment. The 3 final moon landings were scrubbed, and the last astronaut left the moon in December of 1972. Both movements would slow. They would stop and start and shift. That's what movements do, after all. They breathe, they wait, they rise again. But now, the engines are firing again. NASA's Artemis program, if you have heard about it, is preparing to return us to the moon. Not just to visit, but to stay. And not just whiteys on the moon this time, white men in pressure suits, but the first women and first person of color. This time, they're not racing against other nations. We're working with them. We've already had the first successes in these missions. They did a full, unmanned crew that went through the whole capsule, went around the moon, and came back. Because we've learned the goal isn't to repeat the past, the goal is to build on it. We are going back, and we're doing it better. We know how to do it because we've done it before. And it's the same for justice. We know how to change laws because we've done it before. We know how to build coalitions because we've done it before. We know how to stand up for dignity, for what is right, and for each other because we have done it before, again and again and again, and we can do it again now. Even if your part feels small, remember, so is every rivet, every circuit, every hand stitch of those spacesuits. And without all of them, they would have never gotten to the moon. So yes, it will be hard, but we are not lost. We know the way. We know how to build what's never been built before. We know how to reach across lines that we didn't draw. We know how to turn heartbreak into progress and pressure into purpose. We went to the moon once, and we're going to do it again. We've done this before, and we're doing it now. And we will keep doing it if we choose to. If we choose to go to the moon, we can get there. From John Lewis, Across That Bridge, Life Lessons and a Vision for Change. It is so strange to me that we have learned to fly in the air like birds, learned to swim in the ocean like fish, shoot a rocket to the moon, but we have not yet learned how to live in harmony with one another.